Dr. Joel Heck. I've known him for a while. He presented for one of our conferences down in San Antonio, Texas. He presented on the subject of creation and evolution. And it was very, very helpful and very biblical. So we appreciate his work. But Dr. Heck is a C.S. Lewis scholar. Written 5 books on C.S. Lewis and many, many articles. And at present, for the next several weeks, he is the interim president for the Concordia Lutheran Seminary up in Alberta, Canada. So just just a couple more weeks, yeah. And then he may be going into some sort of retirement, but probably not in another sense. He'll be busy writing and so forth. But we're very honored to have him here. Let me just tell you a quick story about him. I think it was 2 years ago, you were speaking at the Wade Center at Wheaton College in Wheaton, Illinois. The Wade Center is a center dedicated to the works of C.S. Lewis, Tolkien, Chesterton, and somebody else too. I can't remember right now. But it's a very, very wonderful center in what they're trying to promote and preserve there. And so he was invited to speak, being a C.S. Lewis scholar. And during his talk, it got a little controversial because he was defending C.S. Lewis from a good conservative Christian perspective, and he was more or less challenged by that. What just so happened in the crowd that evening was our youngest daughter, and she saw what was starting to happen there, so she turned on her phone and recorded it. And so if you have any doubt about his conservative credentials and how he views C.S. Lewis, ask my daughter. Maybe she still has that recorded, and you can see that he did a good job. But we appreciate his work over the years, and we appreciate him coming here today to talk about the legacy of C.S. Lewis. Let's welcome Dr. Joel Heck.
Thank you. All right, good morning, everybody. Welcome. Happy to be here, and thank you for coming this morning. I get to talk about one of my favorite topics. This first presentation is just 8 slides long as a way of talking about who Lewis was and why he's important for us to know something about. So let's get on into it. Just 8 slides. How has Lewis made an impact? He is undoubtedly the most frequently quoted Christian writer today. More than 40 books, 200 plus poems, 176 articles and letters to the editor written by Lewis that have been published. By my count, 324 published pieces, 14 of them after his death, believe it or not. So not too many people are able to live beyond the grave. Jesus did in a certain way, and I guess Lewis has. His legacy has continued long after his death, including in the publishing realm. So he's known because he's an effective writer in a wide variety of types of literature that I'll highlight at the end of this PowerPoint. His books have sold, by my estimate, more than 250 million copies. About half of that, the Chronicles of Narnia, and roughly 3 to 5 million copies every year, including 50 million in the last decade. This is why his writing is so powerful. He is a master in clarity of thought and the analogy. He's both left-brained and right-brained. Most of us are one or the other. He seems to have been both, in addition to having a brilliant mind and a tremendous memory. Produced a significant change along with J.R.R. Tolkien in children's literature through the Chronicles of Narnia. He was influenced on the resurgence of several British authors. Whenever Lewis recommended somebody, other people started taking another look at this individual, and so we are beneficiaries of his recommendations. Films and plays are frequently being made about Lewis. Maybe you've heard or seen the movie that Max McLean was a large part of, the Reluctant Convert, one of the most recent films that's been put out. In addition, Lewis is the single most important literary influence on J.R. Tolkien. So without Lewis's influence, The Lord of the Rings might never have been published, a book that was named the top book in the UK in four separate the top book of the 20th century in the UK in four separate polls. The Narnia movies, that's probably what Lewis is especially known for. I won't give you the details on that, but I would invite you to take a look at Narnia Web if you want to know the latest on the production of the Narnia movies. More than 200 C.S. Lewis reading groups or societies around the world. One I'm a participant in Austin, Texas when I'm there. Lots of Lewis courses taught at university and seminary campuses. Lots of books and other materials have been written about C.S. Lewis. Google used to give the number of hits when you put a term or a name in there. They don't do that anymore, but lots and lots of hits, millions of hits, in fact. Lewis is part of Poets' Corner in Westminster Abbey in London. You see a list of famous British authors from Shakespeare to Wordsworth and a whole bunch of others. And since November 22, 2013, Lewis is a part of Poets' Corner because his name was added to that list of poets that are famous in the history of the United Kingdom. This is one of the most famous quotations of Lewis that surrounds the stone at Westminster Abbey, where his birth and death dates are recorded. He says, "I believe in Christianity as I believe that the sun has risen, not only because I see it, but because by it I see everything else." A quotation from an essay of his called "Is Theology Poetry?" Evelyn Underhill and J.I. Packer spoke strong words in support of Lewis. Underhill, an authority in Christian mysticism, talked about his remarkable capacity for giving imaginative body to the fundamental doctrines of Christianity. And J.I. Packer talked about Lewis's brain, left for the logical and linear and right for the romantic and imaginative, were so thoroughly developed so that he was as strong in fantasy and fiction as he was in analysis and argument. And a couple of, actually one friend of mine, Jerry Root, and cooperating with Mark Neal to write a book called The Surprising Imagination of C.S. Lewis. And in that book, they talk about 17 literary genres within Lewis wrote, and all of them effectively. Book published in 2015. So that takes us to the end of my first PowerPoint presentation. And let's get right into the next presentation, the first of the two main presentations. I want to thank David for the introduction a little bit earlier. It's always interesting to see how you're going to be introduced when you get invited to a conference, and so it's a pleasure to be here, and thank David for that. Years ago, there was a city in Ohio that was about to celebrate its centennial, and they decided to make a big deal out of this and shoot for the moon and see if they could get a big-name person to come there. This is over a century ago. And they decided to invite William Howard Taft to speak at that Ohio city, probably Cincinnati. And they weren't expecting him to accept, but they were really surprised and pleased when Taft actually accepted the invitation. And for those of you that don't know who William Howard Taft is, he not only was President of the United States for a term, but he also served as the Chief Justice of the U.S. Supreme Court, the only person in American history who has filled both offices. And so they prepared for the conference and wanted to do it upright for someone as well known as Taft. And so they had the center of their city prepared and a stage for speakers to speak at. And but they decided, in order to get somebody like Taft and to introduce him properly, we need to find somebody who can do a really, really good job of introducing him. And they heard that a senator from Ohio by the name of Chauncey Depew was really good at introducing people. And so they invited him to do it, and of course he was honored and agreed to introduce William Howard Taft. And so on the day that Taft came to speak to the city about its centennial, Chauncey Depew got up to the podium and proceeded to introduce Taft for 20 long minutes. And at the end of the presentation, he said, "And now I want to present to you a man pregnant with intelligence, pregnant with experience, and pregnant with potential, William Howard Taft." Now, what you need to know about Taft is that he was a very large man. And so he came to the podium and he said, by way of introduction, I didn't know I was pregnant, but I'll tell you what. If it's a boy, I shall name him after myself, William. If it's a girl, I think I shall name her Carolyn. And if, as I suspect, it's gas, I shall name it Chauncey Depew. So thank you for not taking 20 minutes to introduce me this morning. Let's get into the legacy of C.S. Lewis, where we talk about apologetics as defense. There's some major works of Lewis, and in a sense, some would say all of the things that Lewis wrote were apologetic. He once said, most of my books are evangelistic, and so for Lewis, evangelism and apologetics are very, very close to one another, as they are for me too. So one of the powerful statements in defense of the Christian faith is his famous sermon from 1941 at the University Church in Oxford, The Weight of Glory. His book, The Abolition of Man, that defends objective values. Goodness, truth, and beauty have objective characteristics to them. And by the way, that was my topic at the Wade Center a few years ago. Last year was the 80th anniversary of the publication of The Abolition of Man, and some call it the best defense of objective values in the English language. Mere Christianity, of course, that most or all of you know about. This would be his major apologetic work. And as I take a closer look at that book, this may enter us into some areas that are quite familiar with you, but I hope I can give it a new perspective. His 1940 book explaining why there is pain and evil in the world, the problem of pain, that led him to be invited to speak over the BBC. And the BBC talks, plus a few other chapters that he wrote, ended up with the publication of Mere Christianity in 1952. His book, Miracles, published in 1947, a philosophical defense of the nature of miracles and the probability of miracles. And then one that kind of surprised me when I read poet and critic Leonard Bacon's comment calling the Screwtape Letters the most exciting piece of Christian apologetics that has turned up in a long time. And I don't typically think of the Screwtape Letters as apologetics, but at least Bacon did. And there's some other essays, especially these three, Christian Apologetics. You'd kind of expect an essay by that title to be about apologetics, delivered to a conference of youth leaders and junior clergy. Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, delivered at Westcott House, Cambridge in 1959. I actually had a chance to see the place where he delivered that talk and talked to a couple of people who were there when he did. And a Christmas Sermon for Pagans, which we will look at especially in part 2 this morning, which is an essay that Lewis wrote for The Strand in 1946 and was lost, was never known until just a few years ago when New Zealander Christopher Marsh discovered it. So this is the location of Carmarthen, Wales. So that's the UK and the main part of this PowerPoint or this Google Images map with the Irish Sea separating Ireland from England. So that's where Carmarthen is located. And in that essay, which some of you know the book God in the Dock, which is a collection of dozens of Lewis's essays, that's where the essay is from. In the first half of this article, he is speaking about Christian witness and evangelism far more than apologetics. So, for example, he invites us to check our assumptions about what people think that words such as charity, Christian, atonement, and morality mean. Today, the word Christian means you're a good person in the opinion of the public, of non-Christians. That means just you're a good guy, which isn't really a biblical definition of the word. So a lot of people use terms without really understanding what they mean. And he also says that what we want is not more little books about Christianity, but more little books by Christians on other subjects with their Christianity latent. And in reality, that's what the Lord of the Rings and the Chronicles of Narnia are. Books on other subjects, imaginative stories, fairy tales, but with their Christianity latent. And If you haven't read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe and read the part about where Aslan dies and comes back to life again, you may not recognize that as a powerful Christian story. He also writes that a sense of sin is almost totally lacking in the world today, which is an idea that we need to remember and include in our apologetics. There's another essay in the collection of essays called God in the Dock, which is the featured essay or the title essay, God in the Dock. He talks about the same thing in that essay there. And he goes on to say, in Christian apologetics, in my experience, if one begins from the sin that has been one's own chief problem during the last week, one is often very surprised at the way this shaft goes home. But whatever method we use, our continual effort must be to get their mind away from public affairs and crime and bring them down to brass tacks, to the whole network of spite, greed, envy, unfairness, and conceit in the lives of ordinary, decent people like themselves and ourselves. In the second half of the essay, Lewis says, as he shifts gears, I now turn to the question of the actual attack. That is, he turns to the topic of apologetics, and here are his main points in that essay. He says, do not attempt to water Christianity down. You must frankly argue for supernaturalism from the very outset. Reminds me of a story, actually a joke, I don't think it's a true story, of a guy that was reading his Bible on a park bench one day at lunchtime, and a couple of skeptics came by and noticed that he was reading his Bible, and the one guy says to the other guy, just watch this. He's going to try to make this guy feel uncomfortable, and he comes over and he says, what's that you're reading? He says, well, the Bible. Wasn't the least bit bothered by that. Well, do you really believe all the stories in the Bible? And he says, yes, I do. And how about that story about Jonah and the whale? Do you really believe that Jonah was swallowed by a whale? And the Christian says, well, I don't know. I wasn't there, but I take the story at face value, so I think it happened that way. But I'll tell you what, when I get to heaven, I'll ask Jonah. And the non-Christian, not wanting to give up, easily says, well, what if Jonah's not there when you get there? And the Christian said, well, then you can ask him. The two most popular difficulties, Lewis says, you'll probably have to deal with are these. Now that we know how huge the universe is and how insignificant the earth, it is ridiculous to believe that the universal God should be specially interested in our concerns. People believed in miracles, the second popular difficulty. In the old days, because they didn't then know that they were contrary to the laws of nature, but Lewis says they did. The very idea of miracle presupposes knowledge of the laws of nature. You can't have the idea of an exception until you have the idea of a rule. And he also says, I have found that people are usually disposed to hear the divinity of our Lord discussed before going into the existence of God. Kind of like Craig Parton said yesterday, excuse me, that talking about all the philosophical background and taking time to get to the topic of the gospel and the story of Jesus isn't nearly as valuable as getting to the story of Jesus himself. And I think that's true, because that gets down to the issue of their relationship to God and how they are experiencing the reality of guilt and sin in their lives, which doesn't make them feel particularly good. And we can tap into the unease that people feel, we always feel. We feel it whenever we have turned away from God and committed a sin that offends him. Lewis says some form of the aut deus, aut malus homo, which is either God or a bad man that Jesus would be, can be used. The majority of them start with the idea of the great human teacher who was deified by his superstitious followers, and I put parenthetically there, that's a position that Lewis himself once held. And he wrote to his friend Arthur Greaves about that and said, you just are operating with a legend that was glorified and ended up being a Jesus that the church worships, and he says that's not the way it should be understood. He says it must be pointed out how very improbable this is among Jews and how different to anything that happened with Plato, Confucius, Buddha, Muhammad. The Lord's own words and claims, of which many are quite ignorant, must be forced home. That is, Lewis is talking about a chapter in Mere Christianity called The Shocking Alternative. We'll look at that a little more closely in a bit, with the Lord, Liar, Lunatic trilemma, not a dilemma, two issues, but trilemma. Which of those three do we operate with? Because one of them pretty much has to be true. Lewis also says something will have to be said about the historicity of the Gospels. In fact, hearing Craig Parton yesterday, for which I thank God, really appreciated it, because John Warwick Montgomery was something of a model for me, almost an idol. I've read a lot of his works. But the two things that I have always emphasized in my teaching ministry are, number one, the historicity of the Scriptures, the reliability of the Scriptures, and number two, the story of Jesus. And I've found out that I fit in so well with what Montgomery is about that maybe he influenced me more than I actually realized. But all of you were a school child in 5th or 6th grade when a teacher told a story to one child who told it to the next and to the next and to the next. And by the time it gets all the way around the classroom, the story that's told at the end of that sequence of telling a story to the next student, the story has changed dramatically, and that's actually how a lot of people think the Scriptures came to be written, which I think is a total mischaracterization of the stories themselves. And personally, I would date all of the Gospels prior to the year 70 AD, and modern New Testament scholars tend to push the dating of those Gospels as late as possible, which allows for more and more of the stories to be handed on orally. But I could get onto that a little bit more than I ought to. I tend to digress from time to time. So, Lewis says my own line was to say that I was a professional literary critic, and I thought I did know the difference between legend and historical writing, that the Gospels were certainly not legends, and that if they are not history, then they are realistic prose fiction of a kind which actually never existed before the 18th century. And so here he's picking up on things that he writes about in that essay at Cambridge University called Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism. We'll look at that one a little bit more closely too. Still in Christian apologetics, he says, one of the great difficulties is to keep before the audience's mind the question of truth. They always think you are recommending Christianity not because it is true, but because it is good. And in the discussion, they will at every moment try to escape from the issue, true or false, into stuff about a good society or morals or the incomes of bishops or the location where Jews and Samaritans ought to worship, kind of get the conversation away from the woman at the well's lifestyle, or the Spanish Inquisition or France or Poland or anything whatever. You have to keep forcing them back and again back to the real point. Lewis says here, as well as other places, Christianity is a statement which, if false, is of no importance, and if true, of infinite importance. The one thing it cannot be is moderately important. We are not pronouncing all other religions to be totally false, but we must attack wherever we meet the nonsensical idea that mutually exclusive propositions about God can both be true. Either Jesus rose from the dead or he did not. They cannot both be true. Islam says somebody else was crucified and Jesus did not rise from the dead. Christians, based on the historical Gospels, say he did die and he did rise again. Lewis also admitted on one occasion, no doctrine of that faith seems to me so spectral, so unreal as one that I have just successfully defended in a public debate. But he also says elsewhere that when he was an atheist, there were times when it appeared to him that his atheism was built on sand rather than a solid foundation. So it shouldn't be a surprise that there are times when, as a Christian, his faith seems to be a little bit uncertain, and that's probably an indication of the attacks of the evil one himself. Now, I threw a couple of pictures in here just to awaken those who are starting to doze off, because what I'm doing a lot is quoting Lewis, and I could talk about Lewis, but I think Lewis presents himself a whole lot better than other people do. And so hearing the voice of Lewis or seeing the words of Lewis is one of the best things a speaker like me can do. But this is from the Marion E. Wade Center in Wheaton, Illinois, that David Thompson mentioned earlier. This is the desk at which Lewis did a lot of his writing. There is a display in the background. This is some years ago, display in the background about the Lord of the Rings. This is the Wade Center outside picture of it on the edge of the Wheaton College campus. And if you look closely, you'll see a lamppost in the front yard to the left of the main door that undoubtedly echoes the story of the Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. I took those two pictures as well as this one. This is Addison's Walk, the location where Lewis, Dyson, and Tolkien had a 3-hour midnight conversation from midnight to 3 a.m. in 1931 as they were discussing truth and myth and the possibility of myth actually being true. And after Tolkien left at 3 a.m., Lewis and Dyson talked for another hour yet as they're walking around this meadowed area and a pathway on 4 sides of a meadow. Lewis, as the writer of Mere Christianity, says the reason for his writing Mere Christianity is that ever since I became a Christian, I've thought that the best, perhaps the only service I could do for my unbelieving neighbors was to explain and defend the belief that has been common to nearly all Christians at all times. So that's what he's trying to do in Mere Christianity, and I put the cover of a Chinese edition of Mere Christianity on there because I've been privileged to be sort of an advisor to a couple of Chinese Christians who are engaged in translating some of the works of Lewis into Chinese, and they are writing to me and asking for some advice, particularly wanting to get a chronology, basic chronology of the life of Lewis that they wanted to include in one of their later works. Anyway, it's been privileged to be involved in many other people around the world who are writing about Lewis and promoting the works of Lewis. So I'm going to run through some characteristics of Mere Christianity that has a message for us. I mean, the main thing about this book is that it is apologetics. You probably know this, but the word apologia in the Greek and the Latin does not mean to apologize for something, but to defend something. So it is apologetics. I think it's a reflection of Lewis's personality in that it's rational and ordered on the one hand, but also rather imaginative. It is autobiographical. I think as you read the first few chapters, you're reading about how Lewis's mind operated when he moved from atheism to agnosticism and eventually to Christianity. This book, since most of the chapters were originally broadcast over the BBC, made him a well-known voice in England during World War II, contains battlefield language I'll talk about more. It was delivered over the radio, even though Lewis detested the radio. Some of the topics he doesn't cover, and this is sort of a message for us in our witness and our apologetics, the kinds of things that we ought to steer away from because they end up majoring in minors rather than getting to the real point. Who is Jesus and what does his life on this earth have to do with me and my sin and my ultimate future? So all these topics Lewis doesn't address because he doesn't want to get bogged down in minor issues, at least minor in comparison to the core message of Scripture, which is the story of Jesus. So he doesn't deal with any of these topics that meaningful and serious Christians have disagreed amicably. So the point is that we can easily get bogged down in irrelevant details, and I know some of you will say, well, that's not irrelevant, the story of creation, for instance, or the Lord's Supper, for instance, and that's not, some of those, excuse me, some of those topics would be more irrelevant details, but the main issue is the person of Christ and what he has done for us, and especially the specific matter that bothers the agnostic. Ultimately, the key issue is the problem of sin in the individual's life, which they usually want to avoid. So Lewis wrote Mere Christianity, the essays that ended up being delivered over BBC during World War II, and if you look at the language that Lewis uses in this book, in these original BBC broadcasts, you find that Lewis is using words from the battlefield to address his audience and to draw them into his message. And he uses, since there are about 230 pages in the standard version of Mere Christianity today, more than one word per page from the battlefield that was going on in World War II at the time he wrote this and delivered these messages. So just as Lewis wrote Mere Christianity in the context of World War II, St. Paul spoke to the Athenians about an unknown God and wrote differently to a largely Gentile church without using Old Testament scriptures, and to a largely Jewish church in Rome using frequent Old Testament quotations. So we need to use the language of our audience. So here's a question for you. What two things was Jesus always doing? Since he's the master teacher, and you look at the story of Jesus in the Gospels, there are two things that he's doing so frequently. Number one, he's asking a lot of questions, and number two, he's telling a lot of stories, and that ought to give us some suggestions about both our witness and our apologetics. So one chapter in Mere Christianity, I read through a chapter just to get an idea. How many analogies does Lewis use in book one? There are 4 books within the total book, and I picked chapter 5 just because there are a few there, so let's take a look. And these are the 9 different analogies that Lewis used. They aren't stories. Analogy is, we might call a story in a few words or a sentence or so. And he compares spiritual truths to these different ideas, these 9 different ideas throughout this chapter. Again, a message for us to be able to put concrete form or flesh on the ideas that we're trying to communicate. Another picture to brighten your day or your morning a little bit. This is New Building, where Lewis had his rooms on the lower level in the first. He entered on the first floor, but his rooms were on the second floor, about the middle of the building. So he was asked by James Welch, the director of religious programming at the BBC, if he would talk on the BBC, and this is his response to Welch when he asked what he would talk about after accepting the invitation. I think what I mainly want to talk about is the law of nature, or objective right and wrong. It seems to me that the New Testament, by preaching repentance and forgiveness, always assumes an audience who already believe in the law of nature and know that they have disobeyed it. In modern England and the U.S. today, we cannot at present assume this, and therefore most apologetic begins the stage too far on. The first step is to create or recover the sense of guilt. So book 1, 1941, there's the title, Right and Wrong, a clue to the meaning of the universe. This is pre-evangelism, and I'm going to focus on just one chapter in the 5 chapters. He starts with this analogy. Everyone has heard people quarreling. Sometimes it sounds funny, and sometimes it sounds merely unpleasant, but however it sounds, I believe we can learn something very important from listening to the kinds of things they say. They say things like this: how'd you like it if anyone did the same to you? That's my seat. I was there first. Leave him alone. He isn't doing you any harm. Why should you shove in first? Give me a bit of your orange. I gave you a bit of mine. Come on, you promised. People say things like that every day, educated people as well as uneducated, and children as well as grown-ups. So people are listening to this over the radio as he delivers this very first talk. Now, what interests me about all these remarks is the man who makes them is not merely saying that the other man's behavior does not happen to please him. He is appealing to some kind of standard of behavior which he expects the other man to know about. Objective moral truth, in other words. And the other man very seldom says, to hell with your standard. Nearly always he tries to make out that what he has been doing does not really go against the standard, or that if it does, there's some special excuse. He pretends there is some special reason in this particular case why the person who took the seat first should not keep it, or that things were quite different when he was given the bit of orange, or that something has turned up which lets him off keeping his promise. It looks, in fact, very much as if both parties had in mind some kind of law or rule of fair play, or decent behavior or morality, whatever you like to call it, about which they really agreed. And they have. If they had not, they might, of course, fight like animals, but they could not quarrel in the human sense of the word. Quarreling means trying to show that the other man is in the wrong, and there would be no sense in trying to do that unless you and he had some sort of agreement as to what right and wrong are. Just as there would be no sense in saying that a footballer, soccer, not American football, had committed a foul unless there was some agreement about the rules of football. So this is Lewis in the opening chapter of Mere Christianity, trying to arouse a sense, a reality that there is a moral law and we don't live up to it. Lewis recognizes that everybody sees these moral imperatives. We all realize we're not doing a great job of following them. He calls this the Tao, especially in the Abolition of Man, a broad moral consensus found all over the world, past and present, to which we can appeal. In the Silver Chair, one of the Chronicles of Narnia, Jill and Eustace are given 4 signs to guide them on their quest, very much like God giving the law in the Pentateuch. Even though they muff 3 of the 4 signs, they are still able to accomplish their mission, since we are saved by grace, not by keeping the law in every jot and tittle. You might recognize that Pauline Bain's drawing from the Silver Chair. Lewis says, in other places, he argues the same way. The greatest barrier I've met is the almost total absence from the minds of my audience of any sense of sin. And that's one of the reasons why we don't use the word sin when we're trying to witness to an unbeliever. We can talk about greed or selfishness or broken relationships, failure to keep a promise, those kinds of things. Language they understand because that's the language we use. We want to use the language of our hearers. The Screwtape Letters teach us about the subtlety and deceptiveness of temptation to sin. In the opening chapter of The Pilgrim's Regress, Lewis's first Christian book, when John is learning about religion, we read what Lewis says, knowledge of broken law precedes all other religious experiences. Sounds like a Lutheran, doesn't he? Law and gospel. Lewis had little contact with Lutherans, and he did not use the terms law and gospel, but he understood the basic theology of sin and grace, good news and bad news, judgment and hope, law and gospel. So it's not necessary for us to use those precise terms, but nevertheless the concepts can be expressed in other ways. And he also knew about the need for the law to expose the problem. And so in book 1, he is trying to arouse the awareness in his listening audience of their need for forgiveness. In book 2, 1942, What Christians Believe, I want to focus on the most famous chapter in the entire book, the shocking alternative, what I call the trilemma. Either he is God or he is a liar or a lunatic. If you've read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, that argument actually shows up in that book. So Lucy has been to Narnia. Here she's having tea with Tumnus the fawn, and she comes back, and her siblings think she's a little bit loony. And so Peter and Susan go to the professor to ask, what do we do about Lucy? And so there are 3 options for Lucy. Logic, said the professor half to himself. Why don't they teach logic at these schools? There are only 3 possibilities. Either your sister is telling lies, Lord, liar, or lunatic, or she is mad, there's the lunatic, or she is telling the truth. Jesus really is the Son of God, the Savior of the world, like he claimed. You know she doesn't tell lies, and it is obvious that she is not mad. For the moment then, unless any further evidence turns up, we must assume that she is telling the truth. Now, as we read The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, if we read that one first, we don't know that the professor was actually in Narnia himself as a young boy, but you'll have to read the story. And read them in the order in which they are written, by the way, if you decide to read the Chronicles of Narnia. Great argumentation and powerful stories in all 7 of them. And by the way, if you are not familiar with the C.S. Lewis doodles on YouTube, I strongly encourage you to look that up. This one, especially The Shocking Alternative, has an artist that's drawing what the chapter depicts as a narrator reads the entire chapter, paragraph by paragraph, beginning to end, in about 13 minutes, and then an artist very cleverly, and with the camera speeded up a little bit, illustrates what Lewis is saying, and the 2 come together to provide a very powerful and meaningful argument in favor of the shocking alternative. Jesus is Lord, not liar or lunatic. The principal of Manchester College at Oxford University, a Unitarian, didn't like the logic of Lewis. He called himself a Unitarian, a creed sometimes defined as one God, no devil, and 20 shillings in the pound. Not sure what that means, but anyway. So he wanted to believe that Jesus was a good man, but nothing more, kind of like Philip Pullman, the British atheist, who wrote a series of 3 children's books to try to make atheism look appealing. And so Cross said at a meeting of the Socratic Club that Lewis attended, and he was the president of the Socratic Club, he must allude to the vulgar nonsense that a man who said the things that Jesus said and was not God would either be a lunatic or a devil. I wonder if Lewis was there when he said that. He said that this represented such simplification of the possibilities as only a naive person could perpetrate, who combined a triple ignorance of New Testament criticism, because we know that the Gospels were written decades after the events they describe, and they changed dramatically over the years. At least that's what he thinks, and many New Testament critics think. Triple ignorance of New Testament criticism of psychology and of elementary logic. So he was talking about the shocking alternative in chapter 3 of book 2. Elton Trueblood, professor of philosophy and chaplain at both Stanford University and Earlham College, has a different perspective on this chapter. He says, in reading Lewis, I could not escape the conclusion that the popular view of Christ as being a teacher and only a teacher has within itself a self-contradiction that cannot be resolved. I saw, in short, that conventional liberalism cannot survive rigorous and rational analysis. So, teacher and only a teacher, read that as a good man, but nothing else, certainly not God. C.S. Lewis reached me primarily because he turned the intellectual tables. I was wholly accustomed to a world in which the sophisticates engaged in attack while the Christians sought bravely to be on the defense. But Lewis turned this around and forced the unbeliever into a posture of defense. And oftentimes, when we ask questions of the unbeliever about why they believe what they believe and what their sources of truth are, their sources sound to them, even though they won't admit it, are relatively weak. And sometimes they will have to admit, if they would come out and say it, that their opinion is based upon what they heard on the 6 o'clock news the previous night, rather than something grounded in history. In the Screwtape Letters at Magdalen College, Lewis, who had up to that time been an inconspicuous academician, Trueblood says, inaugurated a new Christian strategy. That, by the way, is a picture I took of the Eagle and Child, where the Inklings met in Oxford for more than a decade, about once a week at the Eagle and Child. Book 3, 8 talks, 1942. Going to focus on a couple of chapters here. First of all, chapter 1 in that book, 3 parts of morality. And I just throw in here a quotation I once heard from Harry Emerson Fosdick, a New York City pastor from the first half of the 20th century, who said that one statement that he has used in conversations with atheists and agnostics is this: tell me what kind of a God you don't believe in. Perhaps I don't believe in that kind of God either. And so often the God that people reject bears very little resemblance to the God of the Bible. And so it's a worthy comment or question to ask. So the 3 parts of morality, Lewis says, fair play and harmony between individuals. Secondly, harmonizing the things inside each individual. And thirdly, the general purpose of life as a whole. We usually think of ethics as the first one, but Lewis says it's more than that. It's what's going on the inside that leads to my behavior towards other people. And then I have to think about where I'm heading in my life. So it's in that third and last part of morality we find an opening for witness that often does tag team work with our apologetic. One of the arguments that Lewis uses in Mere Christianity is the argument from desire. So I want to introduce that and read you one of the great quotations from that book that is a worthy tool for our apologetic and Christian witness, a chapter that doesn't get a lot of attention because the shocking alternative is the best and greatest one in that book. But Lewis writes in the chapter on hope, the Christian says creatures are not born with desires unless satisfaction for those desires exists. A baby feels hunger, well, there's such a thing as food. A duckling wants to swim, well, there's such a thing as water. Men feel sexual desire, well, there's such a thing as sex. If I find in myself a desire which no experience in this world can satisfy, the most probable explanation is that I was made for another world. If none of my earthly pleasures satisfy it, that does not prove that the universe is a fraud. Probably, earthly pleasures were never meant to satisfy it, but only to arouse it, to suggest the real thing. If that is so, I must take care, on the one hand, never to despise or be unthankful for these earthly blessings, and on the other, never to mistake them for the something else of which they are only a copy or echo or mirage. I must keep alive in myself the desire for a true country which I shall not find till after death. I must never let it get snowed under or turned aside. I must make it the main object of life to press on to that other country and to help others do the same. And not only the idea of desire, but oftentimes we've experienced this same sense of eternity, especially I remember when I attended the funeral of my father, and some of you, I think, have had this experience too. It just didn't seem like he was really gone. This is more than 30 years ago. And in a certain sense, he has lived on in my memory, but I think that sense that he couldn't possibly be gone is a hint that he really isn't totally gone, because he is alive. In fact, today is more alive than he ever was during his 75 years here on earth. Let's go to book 5. Let's see, I got 5 slides left. So this is the 1944 series of 7 talks dealing with God, the nature of God. Things like, is Christianity hard or easy? Christ says, take up your cross. He also says, my yoke is easy. Is this a contradiction? Well, witnessing is both hard and easy too. Is that a contradiction? I mean, it's hard because we are afraid of what the reaction might be. It's easy because all I need to do is to say what I know. Even if it's something as simple as, Jesus loves me, this I know, for the Bible tells me so. It doesn't take a lot of training to be able to say something like that, but it does take some courage. Remember hearing about a pastor's sermon to a married couple who came to the altar to be wed, and the pastor began his sermon by saying, you have come here to die. I bet that was a shock to that couple. But the reality is we need to die to self every day. In marriage, it becomes much more obvious, at least if we're aware of some of the issues and how 2 different people can have 2 different sets of priorities and clash on a daily basis. But to die to self and to live for us rather than for me is a hard transition that some people never make. Another picture, looking east from the top of St. Mary the Virgin Church in Oxford, England. Magdalen College is the tower in the center in the distance. And this church, St. Mary, is the church where Lewis delivered the sermon, The Weight of Glory, that I listed as one of the major apologetic works of Lewis. So this is my second last slide. I've got some concluding lessons for our witness and our apologetic. We need to speak the language of the person to whom we are speaking. We are wise to avoid controversial issues because the main thing is to keep the main thing the main thing. Whenever you can, use a clear and basic word instead of a complicated word. Use stories and analogies whenever you can. The gospel is a story. Your life is a story. Sometimes go places and do things for the sake of the gospel. One of the problems we Christians have is that we hang around each other too much, and we do not build meaningful relationships to people outside the Christian church. Perhaps even give a copy of Mere Christianity to an interested person. I know that could get expensive. Instead of using tracts that you can buy 100 of them for $10, you're buying copies of Mere Christianity for $20 a piece. But nevertheless, it's probably going to be much, much more effective if actually read. You might even give yourself a copy to assist in being prepared to give an answer. Teach a Bible class on Mere Christianity, etc., etc. And by the way, I have a set of discussion questions for anybody that actually would want to do that. Just write to me, and I'll be happy to share that with you free of charge. And that takes me on schedule to the end of my first talk. Thank you for your
Thank you very
attention.
much. Very much. So this is so good. I'm waiting to hear part 2, and it's so good. I'm only going to give you 8-minute break instead of 10-minute.
My wife and I own a home in Texas, and Texas is a lot different from Minnesota, as you well know. And I like to say that Texas is a place where it's very difficult to do evangelism because in Texas, the winters are so nice that people can't imagine heaven being any better, and the summers are so hot they can't imagine hell being any worse. So it makes it difficult for us to be witnesses, which isn't true at all, but it's a good joke. So Legacy of C.S. Lewis, Part 2. I probably won't get to the end of this PowerPoint, but I didn't bring books along. Here are a few of them. The two on the far left in the lower right-hand corner are devotional booklets for Advent and Lent that I wrote for Creative Communication for the Parish. They're going to reissue the one in the lower right corner called, let's see, what is it called? I forget the title of it. But anyway, it's an Advent devotional, be coming out again. The upper right-hand corner is an explanation of Genesis 1 from a creation evolution perspective. The one in the middle is a book from CPH, the story of Lewis's switch from atheism to Christianity. The most recent one, the one in the middle is a children's story that my daughter and I wrote in the tradition of Narnia, but the book on the far left, No Ordinary People, subtitled 21 Friendships of C.S. Lewis, and he has 21 chapters that deal with different people that Lewis crossed paths with, a couple of whom became Christians under Lewis's influence and others of whom did not, but people that Lewis interacted with and how he interacted with them. If you're interested, The Lion That Roared is available on lulu.com. I think it says that in my bio in your folder. No Ordinary People from Winged Lion Press in New York, and a couple from Concordia Publishing House. At any rate, I want to talk about a Christmas sermon for pagans that was discovered by Christopher Marsh, as well as Stephanie Derrick, who discovered this essay about the same time, from December 1946 issue of the Strand magazine. The magazine was in decline and published in limited numbers, so that contributed to the disappearance of this article, but it was unknown for decades until Christopher Marsh discovered it and contacted me to see if I could help him determine that it was authentic. And we subsequently co-authored an article about it. Lewis did write it. Article was published now 8 years ago in the magazine that the Marion E. Wade Center publishes each year. So the themes in a Christmas sermon, as we look at this, as we read the essay, that's a scan of the article that you see on the left side of the screen. Lewis, you see a Lewis that loved words and their meanings. He later published a book called Studies in Words, which isn't one of the recommended books of Lewis, very ponderous and difficult to read. But you see a Lewis who championed an objective standard of right and wrong, echoed in The Abolition of Man, and as I illustrated in Mere Christianity, Book 1. You see the idea of myth, which Lewis has developed in many places, especially the Chronicles of Narnia, in his essay, Myth Became Fact. The distinction between the pre-Christian and the post-Christian was especially described in his inaugural lecture at Cambridge University when he shifted from Oxford University to Cambridge University in 1955. He would later assert in that inaugural essay that the gap between those who worship different gods is not so wide as between those who worship different gods and those who do not. So the essay, A Christmas Sermon for Pagans, is an example of Lewis's belief that any possible Christian apologetic must render paganism due respect. You know, Peter says, be prepared to give an answer and do this with gentleness and respect. And our attitude towards the unbeliever should always be a gentle and a respectful attitude, because you're going to shut down your opportunity for witness if you treat them with anything less than the utmost respect. So Lewis talks about pagans back in the ancient world. They believed in the reality of and due reverence towards supernatural beings. The pagan also held to an objective standard of right and wrong and a belief that the gods would hold him accountable for adhering to it. The pagan also knew that he had frequently fallen short of this moral standard. Sounds like Lewis in the first book of Mere Christianity. And despite his best efforts to remedy this situation, his conscience was not at ease. That's how people out there who are unbelievers are operating, even though they probably won't admit it to you. Lewis argues that the skeptical post-Christian is totally at odds with these views. For Lewis, the post-Christian holds to a skeptical belief that the earth is a spiritless realm of physical matter with mankind its highest level of being, its most highly evolved creature. What was once revered by pagan men as a divine creation full of supernatural beings is now viewed by many post-Christians as a mere resource to be exploited, or as a naturalistic world devoid of any evidence of a creator or any evidence of morality. So in this essay, Lewis has sympathy for the true pagan, acknowledging that while that person is every bit as sick or sinful as the post-Christian, the pagan had what Lewis calls a deep sadness, an innate awareness of his own moral failure before God. Lewis heartedly suggests to his readers that true paganism might be a necessary stage to becoming Christian. In other words, we must respect the unbeliever and learn to what extent an awareness of his own brokenness exists in his mind and heart. Throw in a picture here from time to time. This is a picture of Lewis that you rarely see, but taken approximately 1918, during which time he was an atheist. So Lewis rephrases the gospel message into distinctly pagan-sounding terms in this essay for a modern readership who are about to celebrate something very reminiscent of a pagan festival, the birth of a god. For Lewis, Christ, whom he calls the Mighty One in this essay, is a God who could perform a wonder that no pagan god of any age could, the removal of guilt and the reconciliation of humanity to the divine. Modern pagans are different. He makes an identical suggestion in his essay, Modern Man and His Categories of Thought. Written about the same time as this Christmas sermon, Lewis adds, if they were Stoics, Orphics, Mithraeus, and better still, peasants worshiping the earth, our task might be easier. If they were total pagans, that is why I do not regard contemporary paganisms that have a spiritual foundation or characteristic to them, theosophy, anthroposophy, Christian Science, and the like, as a wholly bad symptom. So Lewis says in this essay, some claim that Christ's incarnation, death, and resurrection bears a resemblance to the myths of Balder, Osiris, and other stories. Therefore, they claim the Christian myth is no more valid than these other myths. It's just one that we happen to appreciate more than the others. So Lewis was willing to call the story of Christ a myth, but a myth that really happened. So he's using the term myth not in the sense of a non-historical fairy tale, but a story that has a certain shape or pattern to it. He wrote, we must not be nervous about parallels in the pagan Christ. They ought to be there. It would be a stumbling block if they weren't. And in Miracles, his book, he called myth a real though unfocused gleam of divine truth falling on human imagination. And so you have all these pagan stories that are forerunners to and anticipations of the one time when a myth of a dying and rising God actually takes place in human history in the person of Jesus. So this is probably from 1946. Lewis had a photo shoot with Life magazine and another photo you don't often see. So there are three kinds of people in a Christmas sermon for pagans. Lewis says those who are sick and don't know it. And those are a lot of the people that we meet in our everyday world. Those who are sick and know it. And even the post-Christian, if you talk about the reality of broken relationships, broken promises, selfishness, greed, and envy in our lives and theirs, they begin to become aware of that reality. And those who have found the cure. If you start in the first class, Lewis says you must go through the second to reach the third. For in a sense, all that Christianity adds to paganism is the cure. Maybe some of you have heard of this famous quotation from D.T. Niles, who once said that Christian witness is simply a matter of one beggar telling another beggar where to find bread. You found the bread. In fact, you found the bread of life, but they haven't yet. And so that's why humility needs to accompany our gentleness and reverence. So he says similar things in other essays in God in the Dock. He says we have to convince our hearers of the unwelcome diagnosis before we can expect them to welcome the news of the remedy. He says knowledge of broken law precedes all other religious experiences. So Lewis was consistent on the necessity of the law having an impact on our lives before the message of forgiveness carries its sweetness and its power. So we ought not to talk about sin, justification, righteousness, sanctification, those heavy theological terms, but about language that is characteristic of the lives that the people we meet live. So on to modern theology and biblical criticism, one of my favorites of all time that Lewis wrote in 1958. A fairly liberal theologian wrote a book called Windsor Sermons. He was a noted liberal and dean of King's College, Cambridge, the famous music school. One day, Lewis was talking to the principal of Westcott House, the head of that house, later the Bishop of Edinburgh, Reverend Kenneth Carey. After reading part of one of Vidler's sermons, and Windsor's sermon entitled The Sign of Cana, in the lobby waiting for Carey, Carey asked Lewis what he thought. Lewis expressed himself very freely about the sermon and said that he thought it was quite incredible that we should have had to wait nearly 2,000 years to be told by a theologian called Vidler that what the church has always regarded as a miracle was, in fact, a parable. Voila. Wow. Thank you, Vidler, for clearing up 2,000 years of Christian history. Excuse me. So here is the cover of the book. Picked up a copy of it, read the sermon. This is the entrance to Westcott House in Cambridge. That on a sabbatical in Cambridge, England, I spent some time wandering around the city of Cambridge and especially checking out this college, theological college of the Church of England, namely Seminary. So this is that door is the door through which you walk in order to get into the room where Lewis gave the lecture. And this is the room where the lecture was given. I had my wife take a picture of me there, but I didn't bring that picture along because I thought that was a little bit too pretentious on my part. But nevertheless, these are the four main points that Lewis offers in this address. Number one, biblical critics lack literary judgment. They read between the lines of ancient texts. They don't understand extra-biblical literary genres. One theologian called John's Gospel a romance, and he says, I don't know where this guy's coming from. I may have studied John's Gospel his whole life, but I have read romance for my entire life, and I can tell you, I can feel whether a story is a romance or not, and John's Gospel definitely is not that. Number two, some wrongly claim that the real teaching of Christ came rapidly to be misunderstood and has only been recovered by modern scholars like Vidler, clarifying the miracle of Jesus as a parable, or at least distorting it as a parable. Thirdly, some wrongly claim that miracles don't occur. That one's easy enough to grasp. And number four, attempts to recover the origin of a text often occur. You see, as that's the case with me, in all the writings that I've done, Lewis says, the critics almost inevitably get wrong where this story that I just wrote came from. And so this is also true for biblical criticism as well as for the works of Plato and Shakespeare in years past. So one of the strengths, this is another picture of Lewis. I like to throw some pictures at you that show Lewis at time. You've probably seen a lot of the standard photos, but when Lewis was 5 years old, this is what he looked like. This is a picture of C.S. Lewis. He was a scholar of English literature. He was a student of history and a lay reader of the New Testament. He was the author of the book Miracles at the time that he gave this lecture on modern theology and biblical criticism. And he was a writer speaking from personal experience, but once again as a scholar of literature, and I think he devastates the New Testament critics who seem to have as their major goal to undermine our confidence in the reliability of the Gospels as historical documents. So I met Don Cupid there in Cambridge. He was a one-time dean of Emmanuel College. He had been present when Lewis gave his talk, and he talked about the importance of translating the New Testament Gospels into the language of the people, kind of like Rudolf Bultmann once did. He called it demythologizing the New Testament because Bultmann had concluded, of course, miracles don't occur, and anytime you run into a miracle in the Gospels, that can't possibly be true, shows you the presupposition that Bultmann came to the text of Scripture with rather than one that he derived from the text of Scripture. The Jesus Seminar, especially led by Dominic Crossan, you may have heard of this, the group of scholars that voted on the sayings of Jesus, the likelihood that the sayings of Jesus were actually spoken by Jesus, and they came to the brilliant conclusion that 18% of the stories that Jesus, or sayings that Jesus told, were actually told by him, as though they were there when it happened, and just rather pretentious and preposterous, I guess is an even better word for the results of the Jesus Seminar. Thomas L. Thompson is another person that Cupid argued in favor of. An Old Testament, Thompson described, was a recorded history of what should have happened rather than what actually happened, and I totally reject that. My doctorate is in Old Testament, by the way, so I think I know what I'm talking about when it comes to the Old Testament. So, shortly after this talk by Lewis at Westcott House, John Robinson wrote a book that was published called Honest to God, and it was actually used, referred to by one of my seminary professors, where Robinson wanted to change the way that we thought about God, and Our Image of God Must Go was the title of the article. He was the bishop, Anglican Bishop of Woolwich, and he had this article published in the Observer called Our Image of God Must Go. 1 week later, Lewis wrote an essay. The Observer invited him to respond to it and said, "Must our image of God go?" And of course, Lewis is defending the long-standing traditional understanding of the four Gospels as history, or as he called John's Gospel in this essay, Modern Theology and Biblical Criticism, reportage, that Don Cupid was flabbergasted by. He thought, how could any scholar possibly think that the Gospel of John recorded actual history? That was Cupid. Tells you a little bit more about him than it does about the Gospel of John. So one book that I read a couple decades ago is really excellent on New Testament criticism, a Scottish Presbyterian scholar by the name of Richard Bauckham, Jesus and the Eyewitnesses, where Bauckham argues that the Gospels were written by people who either saw the events that they described, which is the way you wrote history in the first century, or was described to these authors by people who actually saw it. Rather than the way we think of history, somebody writing today about the Civil War, for instance, 150 years ago, that's not the way first century stories were written, but they were written by people who are eyewitnesses, and Luke especially makes that clear in the opening verses to his gospel. So what about Lewis's talk? Was it a negative reaction to Lewis's combative style? Was it a question of Lewis's theological credentials because he's a layman? He admitted lack of theological training. It does in this essay and others. Was it a challenge to Lewis's literary competence or a matter of theological difference? I noted as I talked to Don Cupid and emailed a couple of other guys that were there that Lewis was not challenged by any of them on any theological or literary points. I submit that it was theological differences represented especially by Alec Vidler and John Robinson, which could not be refuted by opponents in his audience, so they did the next best thing. They attacked the individual because they can't attack his arguments. They questioned his credentials. Lewis was great at analogy and illustration. And so I want to illustrate, I talked about that in the first part, but I want to go back to it again. So when Lewis is writing Christian apologetics or in any other genre, his writing is full of story, analogy, metaphor, picture language, creating an imaginative ground for a response. A brief survey of Mere Christianity produces the following list, and I give Michael Ward credit for this list. He writes that coming to faith in Christ, according to Lewis's writings in Mere Christianity, is like joining a campaign of sabotage, like falling at someone's feet or putting yourself into someone's hands. It's like taking on board fuel or food, laying down your rebel arms and surrendering. So he's not using powerful theological language with terminology that the audience can't hear. It's like saying you're sorry. It's like laying yourself open, like turning full speed astern, like killing part of yourself. It's like learning to walk or write, buying God a present with his own money, a drowning man clutching at a rescuer's hand, a tin soldier or a statue becoming alive, like waking after a long sleep, that Lewis described his own conversion like that, like getting close to someone or becoming infected, like dressing up or pretending or playing, like emerging from the womb or hatching from an egg, like a compass needle swinging to the north, a cottage being made into a palace, a field being plowed and resown, a horse turning into a Pegasus, a greenhouse roof becoming bright in the sun. These are all in the same book. I mean, this is Lewis at his best. Coming around from anesthetic, coming out of the wind, or like going home, as Tim Keller so powerfully demonstrates in his explanation of the parable of the prodigal God or prodigal son. So this is Michael Ward's essay, Escape to Wallaby Wood, Lewis's depictions of conversion, in a book that Angus Manouge, who was mentioned yesterday by Craig Parton, put together in a book called C.S. Lewis, Lightbearer in the Shadowlands, and both Angus and I contributed a chapter to that book. So let's move on to imagination and apologetics. If you will, Lewis says in The Pilgrim's Regress, words of wisdom are mythology. It is but truth, not fact, an image, not the very real. It would take time to think about that, to understand that quotation completely. But from one of Lewis's letters, he writes to Arthur Greaves about 5-year-old Michael on December 7, 1935, about the value and the power of myth or story. Minto, that's Mrs. Janie Moore, reads to him the Peter Rabbit books about every evening, and is a lovely sight. She reads very slowly, and he gazes up into her eyes, which look enormous through her spectacles. What a pity she has no grandchildren. Would you believe it? That child had never been read to nor told a story by his mother in his life. Not that he's neglected. He has a whole-time nurse. 100 patent foods is spoiled and far too expensively dressed, but his poor imagination has been left without any natural food at all. So story, myth, fairy tale are the natural food of the imagination, Lewis is arguing, and our non-Christian friends out there need their imaginations awakened at times in order to be able to grasp this powerful story of bad news and good news that they live every single day. In commenting on Percy Shelley's play Prometheus Unbound, Lewis writes, like all great myths, its primary appeal is to the imagination. Its indirect and further appeal to the will and the understanding can therefore be diversely interpreted according as the reader is a Christian, a politician, a psychoanalyst, or whatnot. Myth is thus like manna. It is to each man a different dish, and to each the dish he needs. Could plumb the depths of that quotation a little bit more, but this PowerPoint is going to be available to you a little bit later on. In Shelley, Dryden, and Mr. Eliot, that's T.S. Eliot, by the way, he says, myth does not grow old nor stick at frontiers of racial, sexual, or philosophic, and even from the same man at the same moment it can elicit different responses at different levels, but great myth is rare in a reflective age, like Lord of the Rings. The temptation to allegorize, to thrust into the story the conscious doctrines of the poet, they're to fight it out as best as they can with the inherent tendency of the fable, is usually too strong. Great myth is rare, but it is powerful. So this is Lewis thinking about the individual, and he's drawing this from Plato, who thought of the individual as three concentric circles. The outer circle is the imagination. The middle circle is the intellect, and the center of the person is the will. Excuse me. So in order to reach the intellect, Lewis seeks first to go through the imagination, through the power of story and analogy, and making concrete some of the abstract thoughts that he has. He also says in Mere Christianity, the battle is between faith and reason on the one side and emotion and imagination on the other. Not in the sense of daydreaming or wish-fulfilling fantasy, not in the sense of invention, but in the sense of inspiration or poetic imagination. Lewis says in his essay on 3 ways of writing for children, I thought I saw how stories of this kind, and he's writing children's stories at this time, could steal past a certain inhibition which had paralyzed much of my own religion in childhood. Why did one find it so hard to feel as one was told one ought to feel about God or about the sufferings of Christ? I thought the chief reason was that one was told one ought to. An obligation to feel can freeze feelings, and reverence itself did harm. So you tell somebody how they ought to react to some particular idea or experience or quotation, and our natural tendency is to dig in our heels and think, oh yeah. But we can disarm those defensive measures by telling a story. And in fact, maybe, just maybe, a copy of The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe would be a better tract to your non-Christian neighbor than Mere Christianity. Save Mere Christianity for a little bit later, when they're more interested in a coherent explanation of the Christian faith. But warm them up with a story that conveys lots of biblical truth. He still goes on in that same quotation, the whole subject was associated with lowered voices, this spiritual truths, almost as if it were something medical. But supposing that by casting all these things into an imaginary world, stripping them of their stained glass and Sunday school associations, one could make them for the first time appear in their real potency. Could one not thus steal past those watchful dragons? I thought one could. Tolkien was as good at this as Lewis was. The Hobbit, that picture is from the movies that Peter Jackson did on The Hobbit. That's Smaug at the base of, inside that mountain, Lonely Mountain. Okay, a few other insights from various articles. Okay, as we wrap up, from God and evil, if thought is the undesigned and irrelevant product of cerebral emotions, what reason have we to trust it? Same article addresses other issues. From God and the Doctor, I've been asked to write about the difficulties which a man must face in trying to present the faith to modern unbelievers. He goes on to write about skepticism, about history, importance of knowing language, and the total absence of a sense of sin in religion and rocketry. He says 2 opposite arguments have been used against the Christian faith. First of all, that we're alone in an infinite desert and therefore a creator couldn't be interested in us, versus the universe was probably quite well provided with inhabitable globes and with livestock to inhabit them, and therefore it's the height of parochialism to think that we could be important to God, because there are lots of planets out there with living creatures. On juvenile taste, I was therefore writing for children only in the sense that I excluded what I thought they would not like or understand, not in the sense of writing what I intended to be below adult attention. I may, of course, have been deceived, but the principle at least saves one from being patronizing. I never wrote down to anyone. The inhibitions which I hope my stories would overcome in a child's mind may exist in a grown-up's mind too, and may perhaps be overcome by the same means. Second last slide. In Funeral of a Great Myth, while Lewis held to biological evolution, so he wasn't right on every topic, he opposed the myth of popular evolutionism or developmentalism. He cites D.M.S. Watson, who suggests the sole ground for believing is not empirical but metaphysical, the dogma of an amateur metaphysician who finds special creation incredible. can't possibly believe special creation, in other words, according to Watson. He cites the atheist scientist and evolutionist J.B.S. Haldane. We are therefore inclined to regard progress as the rule in evolution. Haldane admitted as an evolutionist, actually it is the exception, and for every case of it, like a mutation that improves a creature, there are 10 of degeneration. And actually it's more like 99 out of 100 that are degeneration. So Lewis states the myth simply expurgates the 10 cases of degeneration. The evolutionists don't want to talk about all the flaws in their case. Lewis also once wrote, if my mental processes are determined wholly by the emotions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true, and hence I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. And Lewis is quoting Haldane there, an argument that made its way into Lewis's book Miracles a little bit later on. My last slide is another one of those pictures. So this is when Lewis was a student at Malvern College in 1914. So that would make him 15 years of age. He's in the middle row, and the middle position of that middle, right in the center of this photo. And that's my last slide. So I think I'll stop there and turn it back over to
All right.
Pastor
Let's
Thompson.
thank Dr. Heck. So let's take a few minutes for a couple of questions. Come to the mic right there, state your name, and keep it brief, just a question, and no long lectures, and we'll let Dr. Heck answer. Please, go ahead.
Hauser, you mentioned topics that C.S. Lewis doesn't cover in I think in Mere Christianity, and it was baptism, the Lord's Supper, the Virgin Mary, the Pope, and then you change a slide before I could see the rest of it.
Oh.
And those are all the things I like to argue about, so I want to know what I shouldn't be arguing about when doing apologetics.
Well, you want to tell them about the availability of these PowerPoints to them?
Yeah, we'll have these PowerPoints available on our website, hopefully fairly soon.
And I will upload them also on my website, joelheck.com, if you're interested. You can go there as well, but they aren't up there yet. So, yeah, you can look at the whole PowerPoint and see all the list of things that should be avoided, I think.
Okay, but you don't remember what they are, just...
Oh, like
too much.
Worship and music, denominational differences, how different denominations interpret the Scripture, what their formal and material principles are, all kinds of other things. The Pentecostal movement, speaking in tongues, those kinds of things that distract from the main topic is them and God. That's what we really want to talk about, is their relationship with God.
Thank you.
Okay.
Hello, my name is Thomas Hine. I work with the ELS Board for World Outreach. I have a son who is currently living and working in Vietnam, doing lay outreach, lay evangelism. And I've had some discussions with him about how do you share the gospel in the Asian context, in Asian culture. And we talked about the three questions that some apologists say this is the way to, start a conversation. Where are you from? Where are you going? And what's your purpose in life? And so I asked him, have you tried that approach? He said, Dad, they don't even think about questions like that. I said, they don't question where they come from? No. They don't think about where life is going or where they're going? Not at all. They don't even think about the purpose of life. They don't. They just see, here's my life, here's where I'm at. He also mentioned that this whole, and coming back to your comment about sin and not using that word, he said sin is a very difficult concept to teach to them. But I appreciated your comment that you talk about things like greed or selfishness or specific sins rather than generalized sin. But coming back to to these other questions about where are you from, where are you going, what's your purpose? What you've presented, it seems to me to work very well in a Western context. How do you apply this to an Eastern context?
I guess first thing I'd want to do is to get to know the people, their culture, their history, because there are a lot of stories from the past of any nation that you can draw on. Some of the writings of Don Richardson, who wrote Peace Child, how he communicated the gospel in a very pagan Indonesian context, very, very powerful story. And another book that he wrote, one of my top 10 ever, is called Eternity in Their Hearts. And in that book, Richardson talks about how every culture has these stories from their past that have prepared them for the message of the gospel. And the Wa people of Southeastern Asia, for instance, that had a tradition of a white man who's going to come one day and tell them about the true God. They were polytheistic, but they also believed in a supreme God. And this white man was going to come and he's going to teach them about a book. And there's all kinds of fascinating stories that exist within the cultures of the people that we work with. And I guess in Vietnam, I'd want to have people tell me stories from their past, the traditions in their literature, things that are passed down from age to age, and get to understand their culture and their language better before trying to figure out how to communicate and how a story that they tell from their past can be an open door to the gospel. Redemptive analogies is how that's sometimes described.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Other questions? I'll ask a question then, since we have a couple more minutes. So you referred to C.S. Lewis and not being real familiar with Martin Luther. Did he do much reading of Martin Luther, or even maybe the Lutheran Confessions that you know of?
I don't think he read any of the Lutheran Confessions, at least not that I know of. There was a Lutheran theologian by the last name of Cram, K-R-A-M-M, and another one in Oxford, so he had some contact with some Lutherans, so maybe they helped him with this law gospel kind of a thing that he reflects in some of his writings. But as far as reading Lutheran Confessions, you should know that the Augsburg Confession was very fundamental to the Church of England's developing of its 39 articles. And if you read both the Augsburg Confession and the 39 articles, you see a lot of similarity, and there's a lot of historical evidence that the Anglicans used Lutheran doctrines, Lutheran confessions, in the development of their 39 articles. So he was familiar with some Lutheran teachings in a roundabout sort of way.